So feelings are important here. If something was said, and in a court of law, the common person sitting on that jury may think that that was offensive, and the individual felt it was offensive, right? Then that is going to be called an unlawful action. So feelings are important here, right? Because I have to feel safe at work.
Welcome to Mission to Grow, the small business guide to cash, compliance, and the war for talent. I'm your host, Mike Vanoy. Each week, we'll bring you experts in accounting, finance, human resources, benefits, employment law, and more. You'll learn ways to access capital through creative financing and tax strategies, tactical information you need to stay compliant with ever-changing employment laws, and people strategies you need to win the war for talent. Mission to Grow is sponsored by Asure. Asure helps more than 100,000 businesses get access to capital, stay compliant, and develop the talent they need to grow. Enjoy the show. Anti-discrimination laws. Are your hiring practices EEO compliant? I think a lot of small business owners are so busy grinding away, trying to grow their business. They've heard of EEO, the EEOC, but they don't necessarily know, are their hiring practices compliant? I don't think people are out there trying to break the law by any means, but this is one of those things that all businesses, big and small, that they have to comply with EEOC requirements. So the perfect guest to unpack this topic, if you're a regular watcher of the show, she's a SHRM certified professional. For the last 8 years, she's been an adjunct professor at the New York Institute of Technology. She was the director of HR consulting for a 58-year-old HR consulting firm in New York, and she's our vice president of HR compliance at Asure. Welcome, Mary Simmons.
Thank you, Mike. Glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks. So from the top, Mary, what's the number one thing all business owners need to understand about their hiring practices to make sure they're compliant with EEOC standards?
It's just that. I think that a lot of times the states that mandate the anti-harassment, anti-discrimination laws know they have to do these things. And I feel like some of the other states that don't have the mandatory training, which is sort of, honing in on some of these practices, say, we don't have to do it. But the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, governs the anti-harassment laws, and it is applicable to all employers. So ignoring it is the biggest mistake, and digging in and really seeing how it applies to you and how you can work within the parameters of the regulations that works best for your organization. That's the way to be successful and to utilize these practices. And, if I can just go a little bit further, I think that, everybody, might look at this like, oh, I'm not doing this, we're fine. But there also is some paths to success built into these policies. So it's not all don't do that, Mike. There's also some, hey, if you do this, you might find more success in your hiring practices and your employment practices altogether if you pay attention to some of these regulations.
Yeah, I think this is one of those things, classic HR, where the law is pretty black and white, and some of the things super black and white. We'll talk about those. The implementation and results from policies take us into grayer areas than we'd probably wish. Therefore, you end up with, here's the best practices to stay clearly within the lanes. Am I thinking about that right?
Perfect.
Yeah. So let's just start out some basic definitions. Who is the EEOC? What's their genesis? And then maybe even more fundamental, what's the primary purpose of anti-discrimination laws when it comes to employment in the workplace?
Yeah. So, I'm glad that we're taking the lens here of, building this into your hiring practice. I think also one of the misunderstandings about these laws is that it applies to the employees, but it also applies to your applicants, And by the way, it applies to past employees. So it is really important that employers understand these laws. And the law comes out of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They're the governing body of the federal government who oversees Title VII, which is the law that governs that created these laws, let's say. And the requirements on the compliance side are to create a workplace where your employees feel fully heard, where they feel safe, and where they feel respected. And when I put it in those terms, I'm hoping that everybody understands that if you provide all three of those things for an employee, that is going to engage that employee and everybody else in the workplace. And that engaged workforce makes for a more productive workforce, and there's going to be less lawsuits triggered. Now, on the employment side, when we're hiring individuals, you also want to make sure that your ads are not only targeted to who you want to hire as far as their responsibilities go, but it's also targeted and compliant with the EEOC regulations. So if you have both of those things, you're going to have a good ad. And then when we bring the candidates in, we still have to follow Title VII and not discriminate against anyone based on the protected classes.
So let's jump to that. What are the protected classes, Mary?
So the protected classes on the federal level are race, color, religion, sex, national origin, age, disability, and genetic information. And we can go into each of these in greater detail in a moment. But what I want our listeners to understand is that you're basing your hiring decision on the requirements of the position. So I think people, get a lot of noise in their ears and in their minds when they're interviewing people. And yes, I think people have stereotypes, positive stereotypes and negative stereotypes, which can lead to poor decision making when it comes to hiring somebody. But we need to keep in mind that we're making the hiring decision. You're driving your interview questions, which should be exactly the same for every candidate, and you're going to differ because of their resume based on the position.
Yeah.
So, for example, we can't ask all the women that come in for an interview, hey, Julie, can you work nights? Maybe you have kids. Do you have good childcare? And then not ask that same question of our male candidates.
Right. You and I've had this conversation many times. I use the example of my dad. He's a wonderful man. He's 84 years old. He doesn't watch the podcast, so I can rip on him here. I could see him asking questions, thinking he's being chivalrous by asking women one question and men another, just thinking he's being a good person without realizing he's literally discriminating, right? So the a lot of times I think the point here is that these aren't born from bad intentions. This is not I suspect we don't have a lot of highly bigoted racial zealots watching the podcast trying to get better at HR, right? Those people probably don't watch this show. It's the subtle things that people get themselves in trouble that perhaps either come from habit or culture, or maybe even sometimes a misplaced good intention, right?
Oh, 100%. When we dig in a little bit further, obviously sex is one of the protected categories. And what we all automatically think is, sexual harassment, somebody said something inappropriate or touched somebody, but pregnancy is covered under there, Mike. And good intentions from a manufacturer that we support. They had a woman who was pregnant and they said, you know what, Sally, I know you're pregnant. Why don't you just go sit and you can be the receptionist for the next 3 months until you go out on maternity. but she didn't ask to sit down, right? She was fine doing the manufacturing work and standing up. Now she has the impression that she's being treated differently because of her protected category, because she's pregnant. And
Yeah.
she feels like now, if there's any advancements, if there's new policies and procedures that they have on that manufacturing floor, she's not there and she's not learning them. So she's falling behind in her position. So does that give her less ability for the next promotion to team lead, to supervisor? It's not, positive, but you can see where those good intentions can often lead to discrimination. It happens all the time, right? Somebody comes in for an interview and they share that they're pregnant, and employers say, well, I'm not hiring that individual. But you have to make your hiring decision based
Yeah.
on their ability to do the job.
Yeah.
Not, oh, they're going to go out on maternity and I don't want to pay for that. It's,
Yeah.
can they do the job based on the job requirements that I put in the ad?
Mary, tell me if you want to go here now or if we go there later, because this is one of those things, and I wrote it down, and I agree with you completely, but I think it's where people get hung up, because the law seems very, very crystal clear, right? So federally, because I know there's states layer on their own specific requirements: race,
Right.
color, religion, sex, national origin, age, disability, and genetic information. Okay, those are the categories. But you mentioned at the top, the best practices will make employees feel safe, feel heard, and feel respected. There's a use case where perhaps the employer was trying to go over the top to make that employee feel respected, and maybe the employer has this Archie Bunker kind of vibes going on, and then the employee feels disrespected about it. Maybe the employer is just super nice and sincere and genuine, and it's a very thin-skinned employee. I mean, we can cast blame however we want. The law being black and white, but employees' feelings, by definition, they're subjective. How do employers manage that?
Yeah, it's not easy. Listen, unlawful discrimination occurs when a person is being treated differently because of their protected class. Now, this
Yeah.
could mean that, that individual is being treated differently because of their protected class in a less favorable way. So I didn't give somebody of color a promotion, and the person, and it appears in some way that it's because they're a person of color, so they were treated less favorably. Or conversely, others that are not in that protected class are treated more favorably, which by nature means the individual in the protected
Yeah.
class is
Right.
treated less favorably. For example, we did have an employer where all the younger employees were given new computers, and the older employees in the organization were not given computers. And when one of the older employees said, I just noticed that, all the young people have new computers and we don't. The answer was, well, you're not good at using computers anyway, so an old computer's fine for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Literally, that's
Yeah.
what was said. So listen, we're going to talk extensively about training. People say inappropriate things, and yes, I believe it's just ignorance and not knowing what to say and not understanding the breadth of these laws, and understanding, other individuals. But when, we just had an instance yesterday, and the employee is with the organization for 7 years. This is a state that is not mandated to give anti-harassment training. And the individual said, I feel like I'm being discriminated against from my manager. The manager said something significant, upsetting 6 years ago. and constantly says things, and I also feel like I'm being discriminated against by our clients. The employer is responsible to protect that employee in the course of their work. So that could be from the postman, the UPS guy, clients, other employees, managers, interns, anybody who comes into the workplace that they come into contact. It's our responsibility to protect them. And when something like that comes up, we do an investigation immediately. That's part of making employees feel safe and fully heard. We heard you, that you feel uncomfortable. We're going to take a closer look at this because we have zero tolerance for any type of unlawful behavior, up to and including discrimination within the workplace.
We can come full circle here. So if I go back to my question about, the black and white of the law versus employees' feelings, I think our guidance is don't get wrapped up in that weird dichotomy. We're talking, the law is black and white. We're going to get more specifics here in a second. But we're talking best practices to to create a highly productive work environment where your employees love you, you love them, you're all around one big mission and goal, and you're highly productive together. That's the nirvana here. But this is also some just practical risk mitigation, right? Because even in some of these cases that you and I are examples you and I are sharing, maybe in a court of law or in front of some hearing, the employer is exonerated. Maybe their practices weren't discriminatory. Maybe it was just the employee misreading the situation. That doesn't mean you didn't spend 30 grand defending yourself, or the reputation harm that you've done with all of your other employees. Oh, John is suing Mike because of such and such. And it'd be wildly inappropriate for you to share the details of that case or that hearing with all the other employees. But now that seed is planted that maybe you're a bigot, you're a racist, you're a whatever. It's like, these are terrible things to an employment brand and to a productive society. So I think, hear us today in this conversation. We're going to get black and white of the law, but don't get hung up on, those are feelings. That's the soft stuff of HR. BS. These are the best practices to protect your business and to create a productive work environment. Anything you would add or subtract from that, Mary, before we maybe get into more specifics of the laws?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, because feelings here are very important. So what we talk about when we do this training, and we try to customize it, to the extent we can for each employer and industry, et cetera. But one basic message is what offends me might not offend you, Mike, and vice versa. So feelings are important here. If something was said, and in a court of law, the common person sitting on that jury may think that was offensive, and the individual felt it was offensive, right? Then that is going to be called an unlawful action. So feelings are important here, right? Because I have to feel safe at work. I have to feel fully heard at work, right? I always give the example of the receptionist who had the UPS guy coming in and sitting on her desk and literally like touching her hair, but she didn't think she could do anything about it. She was embarrassed to say something to the UPS guy, to her manager. So, her performance, went by the wayside. Now you might say, well, I wouldn't care if somebody sat on my desk and did those behaviors. Feelings are important here. That's almost the crux of the situation, right?
Yeah.
And that's why we do investigations, because, what I hear from the employee or a manager or a client, right? Clients can complain about employee behavior as well. We don't know anything until we investigate it, and we do very thorough investigations.
Yes.
And that really, I rarely say this, but that should really be done by a third party so that the employees feel like they can say things about their manager and again, feel safe to say it.
Yeah, right. Well said. I agree. I agree with all that. Um, Maybe take us through. So you rattled off the laundry list of protected classes, but let's talk specifics for what each of those being certainly in the eyes of the law.
Right. So let's pull out some of them. There's 8 protected classes. We talked about, you know, race and color and national origin. Let me give you a couple of examples. So again, innocent. Somebody comes in for an interview at a major bank that's a client of ours, and the interviewer, who did not yet get their interview training, said, "Gee, that's a really cool accent. Where's that from? Where are you from?" So out of innocence comes,
Mm.
the appearance that we're being, possibly discriminated against based on, the, way I talk or where I'm from. One of the other things here is religion. Now, religion, we could probably take our whole hour to talk about religion because there are accommodations that employers need to make for religious reasons. Some of those so out of Title VII, we're also going to talk about additional laws that some states have put into play. And also, of course, Title VII was created in 1964. There's been quite a few amendments. But when I talk about religion, right, you have people that observe a Sabbath, and what accommodations do what employers need to make. There's also religious. The Crown Act is in many states: Washington, Colorado, New York, um, California, of course. And what
This
that says is
Crown Act is not federal. Those are state versions.
there is a federal, and then the states have more specific,
Got it.
um, more direct policies where it says if based on my religion I wear my hair a certain way, you can't tell me
Right.
as an employer you can't be hired because of it, right? There was a
Right.
very famous case, and I can say it because it's public: Abercrombie and Fitch, which is a popular younger person's clothing store
Mm.
that turned down an individual for a position and literally told the person, well, if you're going to wear your hijab, clothing, religious clothing, um, and not our clothes, I'm not going to hire you.
Mm.
So there's been many, many cases where in an interview, interviewers have used these protected classes to not hire somebody, right? I think the easiest one to think about is age. And over 40 years old is a protected class. Everybody, I always ask this when I do the training: what age do you think? And everybody's like 55, 60, 65. Nobody's guessing 40. They say 40 when they know it. So over
Yeah.
the age of 40, you get additional protections, right? So just to be clear, you can never discriminate based on age. So what's that look like in an ad? Mike, it could be something as simple as putting in an ad, great job for college graduates. So what that infers is we're looking for younger people.
Right.
So your ad and your interview are very important space to focus on making sure that all of your interviewers are not discriminating. And honestly, Mike, it is going to lead to best practices because you want to be laser focused on how that position is going to get filled by the person sitting in front of you. Can they do the job, and can they do it in your organization? Right.
Right.
So disability, another protected class. Really great example. Person comes in on crutches. Very hard not to say, oh my gosh, what happened to your leg?
Right. Right.
but that is not job related. Now I know
it may be, but if you're going to ask, it better be, right?
well, when you say it may be, tell me what you're thinking.
If the job requires you to walk from one part of a building to another and both hands occupied carrying something, right?
I love it. So that is a perfect example. And that's what you ask, period. You say, part of the job responsibility, and this should be a question that is asked of everybody. And that's why when we create these very targeted ads for employers, and just, an aside here, your job description is not your ad. Your job description is very, very important when we're talking about all of these discriminatory areas, right? Because it's going to have physical requirements. Now, those physical requirements are, as you just said, something very, common that the person, it's a essential job function. I would add that to an ad. Conversely, I was supporting a not-for-profit organization that makes and sells cookies, and they had in the ad and in the job description, must lift 50 pounds. I said, those must be really heavy cookies. You have to, you got to test those physical abilities. And the answer from the employer was, well, I just wanted to make sure, right, that if I had them lift 50 pounds one day, that I had it in the job description. You can't write a job description that way in a vacuum. It has to be real. You have to, penny test this, right? You have to make sure that those physical requirements, and those physical requirements could be looking at a computer screen all day, right? And dealing with multiple spreadsheets, right? So that might be an eyesight thing. And when we talk about some of the amendments to Title VII, disability is one of them. We have the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that is going to allow for accommodations for employees that do have a certain disability, right? And we can go on and on and on that one.
Forgive me, I'm gonna jump out for a second.
Yeah.
This is why, and I think we got a few more of these to go through, but I love these examples. So the national origin accent. Hey, what a cool accent. Where are you from? That could it might be just totally conversational. It could get you in trouble. Great job for new college grads. It could be age discrimination without even trying to, right? Oh my gosh, are you okay? I see you walk in with crutches. Could be genuinely sincere, conversational, but you could be setting yourself up for disability. In all these things, what's popping in my head here is, and you led with this, I just couldn't agree more. It's all about what are the requirements to actually perform the job. But before you can do that, you have to have first written a good job description. And to write a good job description, you have to understand the competencies required to perform that job. So job descriptions, job competencies, all these things are so intertwined that if your approach to posting ads or interviewing folks is, hey, just come on in, let's get a feel for each other, let me get to know you, see if there's a fit, that makes a whole ton of sense for a whole bunch of very obvious reasons. But that's what leads to the inconsistency of the interview process that leads to discrimination. So if the only person you ask the question, because like if somebody came in with crutches, I can't imagine not talking about that unless if it looked like somebody who maybe just freshly broke their leg or something, or a cast, right? How could that not come up in a conversation? But if you've done your job creating good job descriptions, understanding the skills and competencies required to perform the job, can you walk from one end of the building 50 feet with both hands free? That's all of a sudden now a job requirement question that you just have to ask everybody, and it no longer becomes a question just for that one person, right?
And you should be asking those questions. That's the way you find, the people that can do the job. Right. And, I get the question all the time. And, you're not going to ignore that the person's on crutches. You're going to go, oh, my office is down the hall. Does that work for you? Or would you like to interview here? And so it's not like you have to ignore it. You're just not going to say, well, I don't know if you can do this job because you're on crutches. It could be they just hurt themselves in the gym. It could be, you haven't asked them the specifics. If you ask them the specifics and they say they can perform the job duties, then you need to move forward away from that. Right. So the last area that we have here under the federal regulations is genetic information. And this is the GINA Act, Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act is the full name. We like it acronyms in HR, but this is discrimination based on genetic information, right? So you're going to say, well, Mary, how do we know that? Well, I will tell you how we know that. So we had an example where one of the employers was interviewing somebody, and they were in the practice of going on Facebook and looking the person up on Facebook, which I caution employers to do, or certainly to allow their managers to do it. And here's why. So the interviewer, who happened to be a manager, not a HR professional, saw on the individual's Facebook page that he was, paying homage to his dear father who had passed away of a heart attack, and, said, it's so sad because my grandfather died at such and such age, same as my dad, of a heart attack. And I'm about that age.
Yeah.
And they chose not to hire that person because it was a physical job.
Wow.
And then there's the other situation where they offer it in an interview, and they, come right out and say, I've interviewed plenty of people who have come forward with their disability. I can't hear in my right ear. Will that affect my job? And I'll say, well, let's talk about the physical requirements of the position, which we already have in our questions if we've done it correctly, right? Written out our questions correctly, and we walk through it that way. You don't say absolutely not, absolutely it will. You ask the questions and you allow the person to answer, yes, I can, answer phones all day long. Yes, I can, whatever those physical requirements are. So by the way, I hope you're seeing that even those traditionally non-physical jobs, like a receptionist, should have some physical requirements in there. And answering phones and how many phones and how often is a physical requirement.
Anything else you want to say on the individual protected classes? I think you gave examples for all the federal call-outs.
Yeah, I would, I want to add one more example, because remember what I said, it could be against a protected class or in favor of another set of employees. So, right, I know I use this example and everybody goes, so there was an employer that came to us to ask for help because they got a little feedback that putting an ad that said no Haitians apply wasn't a good thing to do. I mean, this was just a couple years ago, Mike. So it's shocking, but they were a home health aid and company, and they said, well, our clients say that, they maybe don't want those.
We're not racist, but our clients are, and we want to serve them.
That's basically what the statement was. Yeah. But just as egregious was an ad that was on LinkedIn. Now, this wasn't a client of ours, but it was an ad on LinkedIn, right? So it's going out to a lot of people, and it was a managerial job, and it said, white males preferred.
Wow.
So that is also discriminatory. So I just want kind of make those distinctions for everybody, because it's not black and white. It is a whole heck of a lot of gray. There are areas that are black and white, right? And we'll talk about different ways that people can exhibit unlawful behavior. And some of those are pretty black and white. But the rest it can be very gray. And what I would add is that these are the federal protected categories. And there's nuances in all of them, but the states and the municipalities. So I'm in New York. New York State has additional protected categories to these federal. New York City has additional ones. I'm on Long Island, which has two areas, Nassau and Suffolk County. Nassau and Suffolk County have different protected classes. Most employers don't realize that. So it's really important when you're creating the handbook, and we do a lot, probably 100 a week, we dig in. We're looking for where exactly are you in your state? And yes, North Carolina and South Carolina and some of the states that don't have mandatory training still may have additional protected categories. But again, I'm just going to reiterate for the 10th time that you do have to follow the federal law. But they add things like victims of domestic violence, military status as a protected class, criminal history. Many states add criminal history and gender identity as an additional protected category.
Can you spend a minute on that? There's
Yeah.
a whole trend that's going state by state, even city and county by county.
So this regulation is commonly called ban the box. So what that means is that on an application, you have to take the box off where your applicant used to check yes or no, have you been convicted of a felony? So just to be clear, even federally, you can't ask, have you ever been convicted of a crime? It's only felonies that you can ask. And on the federal level, there's an additional protection here that says that you can't discriminate based on criminal history, even a felony, if it's not job related. So if I have a felony conviction for larceny, and I'm a greeter at Walmart, I don't go near the cash register, I don't deal with money, no checks, no, financial responsibilities whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
You can't use that larceny conviction to not hire me. You can use other things that are in the job description if I can't do what the business needs are, but you can't discriminate against me based on my criminal history anywhere. It's just some states will ban the box. So not until you make a conditional offer of employment can you then ask, do you have a felony conviction? And again, then that criminal conviction needs to be job related to use it as a reason not to hire the candidate.
So you can't discriminate based on. So in this case, so obviously we talked about the big eight, the federal, but then the ban the box. There's other types of state in local laws that are continuing to be passed that can't discriminate because of this history or that history, or they're a victim of this. All good things, but what about? So I can't preclude, I can't not hire you because you have you hijacked a car when you were 21 years old and now you're 40 years old and you're a wonderful productive person in society, right?
Right.
But what if there's 2 candidates, or what if there's 10 candidates for the job that all can do the job? They all meet the minimum requirements. They all meet the minimum competencies, maybe much more than the minimums, the competencies required to do the job. I suspect where employers can get themselves in trouble is using things like that as almost like their ethics. And are you a good person? Okay, all other candidates equal. This person was convicted of the crime, so I'm kicking them out. When they and everyone else could do the minimum requirements, how what coach employers how to think through that, because it's not as simple as, oh, I'm not going to hire you because of that. I got to base my questions and my criteria on the ability to do the job. Well, what if lots of your candidates can do the job?
Yeah. So what I would say is no two candidates are exactly the same.
Fair.
I've been interviewing for 35 years and I've never
Yeah.
seen two exactly the same. So
Yeah.
you have to use your business reasoning to say, I'm going to hire Mike instead of Mary because Mary has the felony conviction, but also Mike has a year more of experience. Mike was more articulate when I asked the questions. So that's why you have the same questions for the same candidate, because I can tell you this, they can have very similar backgrounds, but they didn't answer the questions exactly the same.
Really
So
good
when
point.
they answer the question, that's where you get to how is Mike going to perform on the job versus how is Mary going to perform on the job. So
Right.
those are business reasons that you are selecting one candidate after the other, over the other, right?
That's a really good point.
You just, if you think of going to a court of law, could you defend why you hired Mike over Mary? And if you can't, then you know that you're putting yourself in a liable position. And I would just say, from getting on my soapbox for a minute, the law in New York City is named the Fair Chance Act.
Yeah.
And if we keep punishing people for mistakes they made, they're never going to come into society and be, functioning members of society. And that's why New York City named it, the Fair Chance Act, that everybody deserves a fair chance. But, you know, I also protect employers, right? That's my job. I want to protect you from liability, but I also want to protect you from negligent hiring. So that is a thing that we should all understand.
Yeah.
I had an employer who came to us and said, Mary, person has a felony conviction for manslaughter for beating somebody to death in a bar fight. I have a busy warehouse, and the guys are already screaming and yelling at each other. It's high pressure, high intensity,
Yeah.
etc. And I would say, well, what questions do you ask and what job preview do you give to show that pressure, right? And you will have people self-select out because of those requirements.
Yeah.
And you also may be able to ascertain by asking this person what, you shared with us you had a felony conviction, which he did on the interview. And he probably didn't understand the law, right? So he's like, before you find out, I'm just telling you. And, you know, said I have a really bad temper. That could be a reason not to hire, not because he was convicted of manslaughter for the felony, but because he said he had a bad temper.
Yeah. Right. That's smart. That's really smart. I know a question that comes up a lot. It could be a little controversial, and it could certainly be interpreted as age discrimination. Is the concept of being overqualified? Um, I just know from my own history, I've had different jobs, different roles where I tried to hire, and it really had nothing to do with age. I could care less about age. I tried to hire the most experienced people, and sometimes I found myself retraining old bad habits that I learned that I was better off hiring people that matched these skills. They had these skills, but these ones I would be better off teaching. What give guidance here to keep folks out of trouble, and maybe just I'd be curious for just your thoughts on this concept of being overqualified. Period. It's probably too generalized of a term. Um,
Well, I think it's a really good question. Um, so I think what you have to do as an employer is say, well, what am I concerned about with the over experience? Is it that they made more money, which, let's face it, in a lot of places right now, we can't ask what their past salary was.
yeah,
So is your concern that they're uh, going to made more money, you're going to offer them less, and then eventually they're going to find a job paying that much and they're going to leave? Is it that you think they're going to become bored? Why? Let's get to the reason that you're concerned about the additional experience that they have. Because in most cases, the additional experience is going to benefit the employer versus hurt the employer.
yeah,
So is it really that you're like, well, you have so much experience, you may be close to retirement. So why am I going to hire you if you're only going to be here a couple years?
yeah,
Right? You're
yeah,
never going to ask those questions. But I think the employer has to look at, you know, why am I so concerned about this over experience? Which aspect is it? I think you can get to whether they're, a good fit. I think everybody's probably asking what makes you feel like you're a good fit for this position. What are your concerns about any skills you may lack
yeah.
to successfully complete this position based on the ad that you answered? So I think you're going to be able to, sort
Give
of,
me a grade. Give me a grade. So I'm literally thinking back to an old job.
yeah,
Had I asked a good behavioral question, so like I had legitimate concerns from experience that some of the people that came in with the most experience were too hard to retrain, but not all of them. Some of them adapted. So maybe if I had asked questions during the interview process, tell me about a time where you had to change your approach, you had to change your way of thinking and unlearn something you had previously learned. If I'd incorporated that, how? Give me a grade. Is that a good question to ask?
if you ask everybody
If I, yeah,
and
yeah,
not just the older person that's
right,
overqualified.
yeah, right.
That's the
I would have
key.
got myself in trouble, I guarantee, without trying.
So, well, listen, that's why we work with employers to come up with questions, right? Because you have to understand your culture. I know here at Assure, the reason that we're so successful, one of the many reasons we're successful, is because we are so agile. What does
Yeah,
that mean? That also
right,
means we change things a lot.
right,
So I make sure that I say that on an interview. That
yeah,
is one of the questions I ask every person I interview, because that
yeah,
speaks to our culture. That's why I joined. I think that's awesome, right?
yeah,
So I say, how are you with change? Can you give me an example? You're right, for our behavioral questions.
yeah,
Give me an example when you had to make a major change in the way that you were performing a task or a responsibility, and how you worked through it.
yeah,
And you are
yeah.
going to get whether that's going to be a good cultural fit or not. Oh, I hate change. This was so frustrating, right? They're going to add adjectives in most
Or
cases.
they're going to try faking it, and they can't give you a real life example where they've actually
Right,
demonstrated it.
right. But yeah, I like your question. Just ask everybody the same question,
Yeah.
and I'm good with it.
I got a million more questions I could probably ask here. Looking at the clock, let's talk about enforcement for a few minutes, if we could. Um, yeah,
So I think what everybody needs to understand is that um, federally, we all need an EEO policy. The best way to do that, of course, we include it in every federal handbook. And we include the federal EEO policy, a federal EEO policy, and then a state policy, just to make sure that, you know, the employees reading the handbook understand you're protected under federal law and you're protected under state law where applicable.
yeah,
The other thing that I want everybody to understand is that when you're putting that in your handbook, get a sign off on the handbook when you give it, because that policy is no good if that employee says, I've been discriminated against. You go to a court of law and you're like, well, I had a policy. And the employee says, I never saw it. And you're like, well, I gave you the handbook when you were hired. Prove it. Right.
Yeah.
So, we have electronic signatures. That is absolutely fine. If you're old school and you want to print the handbooks and let them sign physically, obviously you can do that as well. You keep that signature page. And so policy, my advice, everybody should be doing training. But the second thing that you have to do on the federal side is you have to have a posting of the EEO policy. It's obviously something we do for all of our clients, payroll and HR, because it's that important. There's federal and state postings for every employer. And one of those policies, everybody go run to your break room. I guarantee you. And if it's not there, call me and I'll get you a good poster is your EEO policy.
Right. And then maybe the last thing around enforcement, how do these things come about? Is it somebody at the EEOC knocks on your door one day and has some random audit? Is it usually an employee who contacts an attorney and you're sued? I'm leading the witness here because I know some of these answers.
Well, you're making it easy for me because it's all of the above. But I will make this bold statement that happy employees, and I'm putting air quotes around happy, those employees who feel safe, right? They don't feel threatened by anybody. They feel fully heard and respected. And remembering that respect looks different for everybody, and none of us are mind readers, so we have to be very careful in the way we treat our employees. They are much less likely to trigger a lawsuit. And their options, right? So when we do the training, you have to give external and internal remedies. The reason everybody has to do management training is because you want to make sure that the employees have more than one place to go to internally, so they don't feel like they need to go to the Department of Labor in their state, if there is a Department of Labor, because not every state has a Department of Labor, or the federal Department of Labor or the EEOC to make a claim, that they can first go to, human resources, be it our team outsourced or internal or both, can also their manager or any manager is the way that we like to put it, because your manager could be the one discriminating against you. And you always in the policies have to tell them those external remedies as well. But, listen, I'd be remiss if I don't also add that, we're talking about the federal law and we're talking about Title VII. There's a long, long, long list, Mike, of additional anti-harassment laws on the federal side. Equal Pay Act, right? Age Discrimination Act. Those are amendments to Title VII. And then we started to talk about some of the state laws. But I think what is amiss is that the pay transparency laws that are out there, where we need to put the salary range, that's an anti-discrimination piece of legislation, right? We talked about ban the box, but also the sick leaves in many of the states, Mike, those are to protect. Almost every sick leave law says you can take it if you're sick, but also if you're a victim of domestic violence or human trafficking. So I think, a lot of employers may think, oh, it's just sick leave. Well, it's also to protect employees so they don't lose their job if they've been a victim of domestic violence or human trafficking, right?
Right. Mary, I think it's. I'm going to ask you to recap here, just for the sake of time, because this is a deep ocean. We could go for a couple hours for sure. We chose the title Anti-Discrimination Laws. We didn't say Title VII laws. it's anti-discrimination in between black and white federal laws and black and white local and regional laws. The reality is, and I always kind of poke at this with you, and I think you and I have this healthy tension in these conversations where, laws versus feelings, in managing to feelings. If you're running a company, if you have more than 2 or 3 employees, you're not going to be able to make everybody happy. That's just how life works. But the more you can create an environment where people feel heard and respected, even if disagreed with, aside from being the fact that it's just the right thing to do, and it's going to result in a more productive workplace, even so if you're a complete capitalist pig and all you care about is squeezing every ounce of productivity out of your team, good thing to do just for that. But if you have less Machiavellian intent here and all you're trying to do is protect yourself, people will give you a lot of slack. My dad, it was in a different era, but when he probably did incredibly sexist things because he thought he was being chivalrous to women who worked for him, they thought he was adorable, right? They wouldn't sue him, they wouldn't turn him in unless it was. He never did anything egregious, right? So that relationship you build with your employees means everything, and all relationships are built on trust and respect. So maybe if you could bring us home, kind of put a bow on this, best practices for employers to make sure that their hiring practices are in fact EEO compliant.
Yeah, I think, again, I'll finish with how I started, which is that every employer should have a policy that is based on the Civil Rights Act, Title VII, EEO policy, equal employment opportunity. Every ad should have on it, this is an equal employment opportunity. Your federal contractors, because they're affirmative action employers, have to have a longer statement that, we help them with for sure. So, having those interview questions that are asked the same, giving the interview training, because we were talking today mostly about how to make sure that we're not discriminatory in our hiring practices. But I think what I also just want to reiterate is that by doing all of those things, yes, you're in compliance. I'm always going to talk to you about compliance, but these are also best practices to find the best candidates. If you don't ask the same questions of Mike and of Mary, how are you going to compare the two, right, to make the best hiring decision? Obviously, there's going to be some differences based on their resumes, but following those procedures in your hiring practices, making sure that you're in compliance with the application. 99% of the applications I look at are in non-compliance. First thing I do when I talk to an employer, you don't think you're compliant? Let me see your application. You think you're in compliance? Let me see that application. Right. And all of these things that are maybe the outlier states, the ban the box is a best practice for all employers.
Yeah. And this is not just about compliance. Compliance is, I'd say, I think compliance is the foundation of HR, right? Helping us stay compliant with laws and that we're following laws. It's not a coincidence, though, that being compliant and the best practices that lead to compliance also lead to the most productive workforces.
Agreed.
Yeah. Mary, love our conversations. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
And thanks to everybody else for joining. If you got value from this conversation, I invite you to like, comment, share, subscribe to the podcast on your platform of choice. Until next week, we'll talk to you later. Thanks. Thanks again, Mary.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Mission to Grow. Thanks for joining us today. For show notes and more episodes, visit us at missiontogrowth.com. If you found this content valuable, I invite you to share it with a friend and subscribe to the show. If you really want to help, I'd love it if you left a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen. Mission to Grow is sponsored by Asure. Asure helps more than 100,000 businesses get access to capital, stay compliant, and develop the talent they need to grow. To learn more about how Asure can help your business grow, visit AsureSoftware.com. Until next time.